with a long overdue prophetic update for the underground. Over the past few weeks, I've had dozens of people emailing me and on social media just asking me what is my opinion concerning all that has been unfolding in Saudi Arabia and throughout the Middle East. And I think it's appropriate that we take just a little bit of time to discuss this. So most of you are familiar with the fact now. Right now, I'm recording this at the very end of November 2017. And so most of you watching are familiar with the fact that just a few weeks ago, the emerging, soon-to-be crowned king of Saudi Arabia, the young crown prince, bin Salman, suddenly really shockingly arrested and arguably had a few of the Saudi princes assassinated. Of course, they were framed to appear to be accidents and so forth. But suddenly, dozens of very prominent, very wealthy Saudi princes were arrested, including Prince Al-Walid bin Talal. Now, many of you are familiar with bin Talal. He is, of course, the wealthiest of all the Saudi princes, and he is a powerful player around the world, and especially in the United States. I've talked about Al-Walid various times, just to give you a little bit of background information. Probably, I'm going to say this is about 10, 12 years or so ago. I'm not sure the exact dates. Bin Talal actually donated $20 million to Harvard to set up an Islamic studies program. And so Harvard University now has an Islamic studies program completely funded by bin Talal. Again, $20 million. He did the same thing at Georgetown, where we have the Islamic apologist John Esposito, this professor who really is just a brazen apologist for Islam. Again, $20 million to Georgetown. And there's a few others, such as the American University in Beirut. He's been establishing these Islamic studies programs all over the world. Back up several more years, and bin Talal is also the same guy. Now think about this, that donated almost $30 million, $27 million to a telethon that was held in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, specifically to raise money for the families of Palestinian suicide bombers. Now, very simple concept. When you subsidize something financially, you get more of it. When you penalize something financially, you get less of it. It's very simple. So here's an individual who had been funding Palestinian suicide bombing in Israel, Islamic jihad. And yet when he comes along and donates $20 million to Harvard, to Georgetown, to these different American universities to set up Islamic studies programs, they took his money willingly. And then, really just to the amazement of anybody that understands the irony here, he then went to Harvard and gave this big speech and actually lectured Harvard, saying that Americans need to be more tolerant. We need to be more tolerant as a people, specifically, of course, with regard to Islam. Now, this is coming from a prince who lives in a country where it is essentially illegal to convert to Christianity, where you can't build a church, you couldn't even be Jewish, you couldn't even enter the country openly acknowledging that you're Jewish up until something like 15 years ago. It was illegal to enter the country if you're Jewish. Of course, many people did through Aramco, but they would have to hide the fact that they were Jewish. I mean, this is arguably one of the single most intolerant nations in the world. And a prince from there is lecturing the United States, a nation that stumbles over itself to prove how incredibly tolerant we are. So the hypocrisy there is unbelievable. He also has his hands not just in American education system, but in multiple corporations, in media. He's the second largest shareholder in News Corp, which is the parent company of Fox News. He's one of the largest shareholders in Twitter. Just a very well-financed, influential guy. Now, he was arrested. I mean, this is absolutely unbelievable. Saudi Arabia, this is the New York Times, arrests 11 princes, including billionaire Al-Walid bin Talal. And he has been holed up, by the way, interestingly enough, 10 other princes. Again, there were a few that died in accidents, all pretty much within the same night. It seems pretty apparent that they were assassinated. The announcement of the arrest was made over Al Arabiya, the Saudi-owned satellite network, whose broadcasts are officially approved. So the government-owned media. Al Walid's arrest is sure to send shockwaves both through the kingdom and the world's major financial centers. I mean, people like Rupert Murdoch, the owner of Fox News, I guarantee, I mean, he's essentially a financial partner with bin Talal, believe it or not. Lest you think, by the way, that Fox is untouchable, and it's as conservative and above reproach and so forth. Absolutely not. Even Fox News is compromised in various ways. Don't believe that there's any media out there that you can fully trust 100%. You have to be discerning, no matter what you're reading or who you're listening to. It's that simple. So, in any case, they put him up in the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh. It's a hotel that's actually about 10 minutes from bin Talal's house. What is this all about? This is what everyone's asking. First of all, just on the surface, never mind biblical prophecy for a moment, what is this all about on a geopolitical analysis perspective? Well, simply put, since the Americans have been vacating and moving out militarily out of the Middle East, which has been slowly taking place over the past several years, really throughout the Obama administration, it really came to a head. And under Trump, it's largely the same. The United States has been functioning in the Middle East primarily with very, very small footprints. So we're putting in special forces, but in terms of the majority of the larger scale ground troops, we've been moving away from that model for a long time. The point is, if we want to win the hearts and the minds of the people, it's not good to have vast, vast numbers of ground troops essentially occupying their countries. So we send in special forces that help with training, equipping, and so forth. We still have a presence there, but it's much smaller. So since we have been vacating the Middle East, as the saying goes, nature abhors a vacuum. And so whenever there is a vacuum, a new order will fill that vacuum. Without getting into all the issues with Russian presence in the Middle East, other nations step in, of course, that's legitimate. But what order is replacing the order of military dominance throughout the Middle East? Well, essentially, we are going back to the old ancient order, which is the emerging clash between the Sunni Muslims and the Shia Muslims. So again, the Muslim majority Middle East is reverting back to that ancient clash within the house of Islam, within the house of Muhammad, where the Sunni majority, that's about 85%, of which Saudi Arabia represents the Sunni majority, is returning to this historical bloody clash with the Shia minority. That's again about 15% of the Islamic world. So as American military dominance, as that old age is becoming a thing of the past, we are returning to the old age of the Islamic clash that really was unfolding in many ways throughout the history of Islam. People often say that a foreign power is incapable of dominating the Middle East. However, history demonstrates the fact that the Middle East is indeed capable of being dominated as long as it's dominated by a Muslim power. Most often, it's always going to be a Sunni Muslim power. Okay, so the Iranians, they represent the Shia, and then the Saudis, I'm trying to keep this very simple, essentially represent the Sunnis. And of course, Saudi Arabia is the financial foundation for all of the radical Sunni jihadi groups all throughout the world, whether we're talking about ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Abu Sayyaf, all of these radical groups, they all find their ideological and financial source, their foundations in Saudi Arabia. Without Saudi Arabia, radical jihadism, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, all these groups would not exist. Very simple. They build the Islamic centers, the mosques all over the world. They train and raise up the hate preachers. They send them out. They create the literature. Again, either ideologically or financially, Saudi Arabia is responsible for the majority, the overwhelming majority of the vast jihadis throughout the world. So because this Sunni-Shia clash is emerging out of the vacuum of America vacating the Middle East or leaving the Middle East, inevitably there is this emerging clash between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So enter Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He's again soon to become the king. This young guy is only 32 years old. What is going on? Why is he arresting all of these princes and so forth? Well, first of all, there's a few things taking place. One, he claims to want to moderate. He wants to become a bit more moderate. He wants to become forward-thinking. He wants to create a nation that can interact with the rest of the world, get away from radicalism. Is that legitimate? It probably is. There's probably an element of truth to that. On the other hand, all of these arrests, what he claims, what he says it's all about, is arresting individuals that have been milking the country, milking the common Saudi people of their money. So Saudi Arabia, financially speaking, is probably one of the most opaque nations in the world, financially speaking. What that means is when you have individuals like Al-Wali bin Talal and all these various princelings, these different princes, these billionaires, their money, in terms of understanding where it goes, who it comes from, etc., it's unfathomable in terms of how non-transparent, how opaque it is. No one knows. And so some people who are familiar with Saudi Arabia, and again, I've read probably a dozen or so books just on Saudi Arabia. It's just a fascinating, bizarre, crazy place. But roughly half of the money, it is said, goes to bribes. So if you want to do business with the Saudis, you have to bribe one of these various princes. And so Crown Prince bin Salman, what he's essentially been up to is shaking down these guys. I don't know what's going to happen long term, if he's eventually going to let them out, but before he does, he is going to confiscate a lot of their wealth. And he's going to put the fear of God into them. He's going to scare them. I've been sort of joking, half joking, but making the point that this is not legitimate reform. If people ask me, what do I think? I don't think this is legitimate reform. This is essentially one segment of a crime family shaking down another part of a crime family. So just think of, if you've seen the movies, think of Casino, think of Goodfellas, think of, any of these, The Godfather, these sort of classic mafia movies where suddenly one segment of the Italian crime mafia family takes out another big family and just executes everybody. That's sort of what has been unfolding in Saudi Arabia. Crown Prince bin Salman is setting himself up for the future. He's saying he wants to become popular among the people. He's saying, hey guys, I'm not going to let these princes continue to steal your money. Now, we need to recognize another fact with regard to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is roughly 30 million people right now. So think, 3 times 10 million. 30 million people. Roughly 1/3 of the entire population are foreign workers. They come from the Philippines, they come from Indonesia, they come from Iraq, they come from all over the world, really. And they essentially live as slaves. They live as, construction workers, as housemaids, you name it. Many of the laborers, they actually live in these trailers at night. They're locked oftentimes in these trailers in very difficult conditions, whereas the rest of the country, again, roughly 20 million Saudi citizens, they all essentially live off of welfare, the wealth of Saudi oil. And so it's a very unique economy. And so when someone comes along, a populist like bin Salman, he goes, hey, these guys are ripping you off blind. They're taking your welfare money. We're going to shake them down. He is going to be quite popular. So we just sort of need to understand the dynamic from the Saudis' perspective of what's happening. But beyond this sort of populist move to ingratiate himself among the people, to set himself up as a populist emerging leader, and again, he's 32, so that means he could be the king for a long time. He is also looking forward, and he's recognizing what's unfolding right now throughout the Middle East, which is the Iranian ascendancy. So although the Shia only represent 15% of the Muslim world, Iran has emerged really as arguably the single most powerful bloc, if you will, or the most powerful nation in the Middle East. They have incredibly powerful and large military, a very sophisticated military. Really, the Iranians, the Persians, if there's a word that describes them, it actually is sophisticated. They are incredibly patient. They are incredibly calculating. They play the long game. I'll say this over and over. They play the long game. They're very forward-thinking, and they move forward inch by inch. Now, they recognize the fact that if they do anything too aggressively, too hastily, that either Israel or the United States or the Saudis, someone will act. So they're always moving forward, but never fast enough that it will spark a major regional full-scale war or a Israeli attack on one of their nuclear bases or one of these sort of things. They're always They're always thinking, how can we just keep moving forward little by little, inch by inch? And so the Iran has been very good at that. Now, Iran functions primarily, they also practice the deniable plausibility, which is to say they function through proxies. So Iran essentially right now, and this is so critical to understand, Iran controls the capitals. They control four nations, the capitals of four foreign countries. Iran essentially controls Lebanon. For all practical purposes, Iran controls Beirut through their proxy, their militia called Hezbollah. Most of you are familiar with that. Hezbollah has slowly emerged over the past decade plus 15 years in Lebanon as the most powerful entity, arguably more powerful than the government itself. The government came to recognize we can't do anything without Hezbollah backing, and so Hezbollah has become part of the government. And again, that is Iran. They are beholden to Iran. In the nation of Syria, through the dictator Bashar Assad, who is an Alawite. Okay, so this is a sect of Shia Islam. Assad is beholden to Iran. So here you have Lebanon, you have Damascus, you have Beirut, then Iraq. Iraq, after the United States took out Saddam Hussein, the majority in Iraq, particularly from Baghdad south, are Shia. And so, of course, after we took out this Sunni dictator, Saddam Hussein, it was only a matter of time until Iran stepped in and essentially controls the government. President Abadi is largely a pawn of the Iranians. And then, of course, Yemen, just to the south of Saudi Arabia, Iran controls Yemen. They also have their tentacles, their fingers deep inside Pakistan and Afghanistan, and some would say they essentially control those too. Although Afghanistan and Pakistan, of course, have a much larger Sunni number there, so it's a little bit more difficult for them to gain control. Whereas down in Yemen, it's through the Houthi rebels, which are a kind of Shia. They're much, much closer to the Shia, of course, than they are to the Sunnis, although they're sort of a slightly different sect. Won't get into all the details there, but the point is this. Over the past few years, we've looked at ISIS. We go, man, this is gruesome, this is brutal. They're beheading people, they're committing genocide, human trafficking, sex slavery, all of this grotesque, satanic, evil stuff. Yes, the radical groups, the Sunni radical jihadi groups, they are the most grotesque. However, Iran is the most powerful right now. So when you hear the Israelis saying right now Iran is the greatest state sponsor, global state sponsor of terror, you hear Americans say that. Some people will accuse Americans of saying, no, this is nonsense. You're in bed with the Saudis. They're the genuine true state sponsors of terror. There's truth to that. But the reason that we continue to cast Iran as the greatest bad guy is because they are the most powerful and they represent the single greatest existential threat. They have the capability to literally wipe Israel's existence out more than any other entity right now. Israel can deal with ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, all these groups, these little ragtag groups. They can deal with them far more readily than they can with Iran, that is arguably already has nuclear capabilities. So first of all, they represent the greatest existential threat to Israel. They also represent the greatest threat to Europe and even the United States. Again, Iran is determined, Iran is calculating, Iran is sophisticated. I talked to my special forces friends that have spent a lot of time in Iraq, and they go, listen, we bump up against these Al-Qaeda type of guys, these ISIS guys, largely they're, 18-year-old, they're in their early 20s, ragtag guys, they got an AK-47. I understand ISIS was a bit more sophisticated, but by and large, Al-Qaeda, these are just ragtag guerrilla groups that are, given to Sunni radical jihadism. He goes, but when we bump into the Iranians out there on the field, he goes, they're from Iran. They've got night vision goggles, they are special forces, they're in equal par, if you will, with American special forces. They are well-trained, highly sophisticated, well-funded individuals. So the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the IRG or Sepah, as they call it in Iran, this is a very sophisticated military. Won't get into all the ins and outs regarding Iranian military. So here you have the Saudis that are looking across the Gulf